Hello, welcome back to Modern Languages 331, World Languages and Their Speakers. My name is Dr. Michael Hughes. I'm your teacher, and we're learning here today at Cal State San Marcos. Today we're going to talk about the history of the English language. We're going to first go briefly into Proto-Indo-European, which is the mother tongue of many different language families. Talk a little bit about how language changes, and then we'll talk specifically about the history of English. So first of all, language change and language families. The thing we need to remember is that language is not ever static, and it just can't be, right? It's a human thing, and as language gets passed on from generation to generation, it's going to change. Um, right, and you probably, if you think about how your parents and how your grandparents talk, you can see that they have maybe slightly different pronunciations of some words or some vowels, or have different uh, idioms and things like that. And over time, right, those things build up into change, and you get different kinds of change, right? So you can have phonological change, that's change to the sound system. You might get syntactic change, that might be changes to word order, to the way questions are made, the way different kinds of negative and positive items are used. And then, of course, you get lexical changes, right? So new words enter the language, old words fall out of fashion. Um, and so the words that the language you're always using, even, the word might not leave the language, but uh, what the word means might change over time as well. Change sometimes just sort of naturally from within the speech community, but there's also lots and lots of effects that living a long time next to other people can have on a language. There's these things called areal effects, where a whole bunch of language in the same area will have particular syntactic properties, but they're not necessarily directly related to each other. And then, of course, there's war and conquest and things like that. And so language change can also be imposed on the community. Um, you can look at the history of the Americas, for instance, and see what happened to the languages of the Americas as colonial European languages were imposed upon people here. Okay. So we've talked about this already before, sort of people leaving Africa and expanding. So by 200,000 years ago, modern humans, well, 250, who knows? Uh, Humans were starting to move around all over Africa. By 60, 70,000 years ago, humans leave Africa and start colonizing the rest of the world. North America, at least 12,000 years ago, that's the old estimate. Probably 20,000 years ago, people were in North America, and by 12,000 had colonized pretty much both continents. Um, when we talk about how people move, it's not the case that hunter-gatherers don't just, they're not just walking randomly from one place to another. Typically, hunter-gatherers have a territory, that they move seasonally from place to place within the territory, depending on what's available when it's a good time to, pick this kind of fruit, or when it's a good time to find this kind of animal. In the olden days, before 10,000 years ago at least, when a population got too big, then bands will split up, and one part of the band will go find a new territory, and that's how humans expanded across the world, right? Not sort of made a beeline from Africa to Australia, but people left Africa, established a group and a territory. When the group got too big, if it was a successful group, then the group would expand by moving, breaking apart and moving farther and farther into new territory. Um, 120 people seems to be about the limit on Stone Age or hunter-gatherer populations. It's about how many people. It's easy to remember who you owe stuff to, who owes you, to be able to keep track of what people are doing. Um, lots of modern innovations or human innovations had to happen to allow people to live in bigger and bigger societies. Um, but you can imagine, right? So let's say this band, one band breaks off and heads, and they cross a river, or they go to the other side of the mountain. And if people stop interacting frequently, right, two groups of people who used to have the same language, each group will start accumulating differences in the language, and over hundreds or thousands of years, they won't be able to understand each anymore, right? And that's how you get new languages and new dialects and things like that. Okay, good. And then the other thing we need to talk about with respect to Proto-Indo-European and the history of Indo-European languages is the first agricultural revolution. Um, So somewhere around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, people in Western Asia, right? So that what we know of as we think of today, you've probably learned it as the Fertile Crescent, right? So the area stretching from basically the Nile River eastward into the Tigris and Euphrates, right? So what's modern day Egypt, Israel, Syria, uh, Iraq, that area, right? The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and that's where agriculture starts. And agriculture it doesn't like just people just automatically stop, right? This happens over the course of several thousand years, people going around in the same territories, selecting the sorts of plants that grow, and then eventually deciding, oh, there's enough resources here that we can just settle and we don't have to keep walking around. And right, so people start to build cities, um, and people start learning how to live next to each other. And there's a lot of evolutionary change that happens, and that people don't just tear each other apart. Um, but people start building cities, and there's good things about the cities, right? That you're able to pool your resources, you're able to have common defense. The fact that lots of people are trying to get things done means you get technological advances on, on cleanliness, on hygiene, on how to grow things, on how to build things, how to build weapons. But also, right, living close, cheek by jowl with other human beings also means there's more disease. The fact that typically in an agricultural system like this, you're relying on just a couple of crops rather than hunter-gatherers having access to to the whole panoply of foods in nature. If there's if it doesn't rain or the crops fail, right, there's a higher likelihood of famine and actually shorter lifespans in early cities compared to hunter-gatherer groups. But that was a trade-off people were willing to make, and also what happens, right, is over the course of time, right, you get more of the good than the bad, and these groups, these cities, these towns, these people who have farming technology begin to spread. And the people who are most interesting to us with respect to Indo-European are a group that might be called the Kurgan or the Yamnaya people that probably um, originated around here, right? So what's today southern Russia, maybe over here in what's today Ukraine. Um, but you can see, right? So here's our Fertile Crescent down from the Nile over here to the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and these are part of that larger expansion that happens with agriculture. So the Indo-European folks that we're most interested probably were living here. At the latest 6,000 years ago, people are probably more likely these days to say something like 8 to 10,000 years ago when this expansion started. Um, uh, Beforehand, we could just base it on how fast we think languages were changed, but today we also have evidence from things like DNA. So it wasn't just one language here, but a bunch of groups, right? As you can imagine, right? It's a pretty big area, but a bunch of people speaking related dialects. And as they become prosperous, as they have more and more children, as they're better able to make use of the land, they start expanding into areas that are other hunter-gatherer groups. So that expansion began probably around 6,000 years ago. Maybe earlier. Like we said, there's still some argument about all of that. And that's based on genetic and linguistic evidence. They're probably, so Kurga or Kurgan are these burial mounds. And so there's a culture called, that's now called the not Yamnaya culture. It was often called the Kurgan culture, but that's just sort of a general term. But these mounds are all over the place in the steppe area in southern Russia. And you can find all kinds of archaeological artifacts. They probably were, they had domesticated cattle, and probably also domesticated sheep and horses and things like that, right? So they were pastoral and also agricultural, and that allowed them to expand across Europe, but not just Europe. They'll also be expanding eastward and then down all the way into what's today India. Um, Okay, right. So here you can see the extent of Indo-European languages today. Well, obviously, right. So we're not including places like Australia and the United States, and Central and South America where there are Indo-European languages spoken because those migrated there later. But before the advent of seafaring, this is what the extent of the Indo-European languages look like. So here, for instance, in Russia, we want to be a little bit careful. So there's a lot of there's a lot of languages in Russia that aren't Indo-European languages here in the Ural Mountains and out in Siberia and things like that. So, but Russian itself is an Indo-European language. You can see there are a couple non-Indo-European languages in Western Europe. So, and these Hungarian, Estonian, and Finnish are all related to each other. They're Finno-Ugric languages, and they're related to, like I said, the non-Indo-European languages that are spoken in the Caucasus Mountains. You can see, right, there's a little bit of Turkish spoken here too in Turkey, right? And then also over here, there's Basque, which is also a non-Indo-European language. There's nothing, Basque. You used to hear things like, "Oh, the Basque people are descended from aliens or something." They're not. They're just regular human beings who kept speaking their own language in the face of Roman domination. They lived in the mountains and they were culturally fiercely independent. Okay, in any case, you can see though that, for instance, Afghanistan, right? So Pashto, Persian, and then Hindi, and lots of languages all the way down through India. Those are all Indo-European languages. Iranian is not spelled with the Latin alphabet. Iranian is spelled, or sorry, Persian or Farsi is spelled with Arabic alphabet, but it's still related to Indo. Clearly, there's been lots of influence. Right, we talked about aerial features earlier, between Arabic and Iranian languages. There's also Kurdish down here. Um, you can see the dark red. This is the Indo-European languages. This red is misleading. Those are Celtic languages. Celtic used to cover most of Western Europe, but has been relegated to the ends, right? And the Germanic languages in yellow here too. Okay, here's another way to look at it and group all of the different languages, right? Sort of thinking about Indo-European starting in the middle and then spreading out across the different ways. Some of these languages are bigger than others. Not all of the languages in Indo-European are listed here, right? So there's Indo-European is probably the largest language group on the family, or sorry, language group on the planet. Where else would it be? Uh, Maybe 2,000 languages altogether, maybe more, maybe less, but around 2,000. Okay. Good. Another way of looking at it, again, this is just a tiny tree of showing relationships between languages. Here we are down here in English, and you can see English is Germanic language, right? So from West Germanic into Anglo-Frisian, and then Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. We're going to talk a little bit about how French had an influence on English as well. But you can see all the different groups, right? Celtic is the language, right? If you're a basketball fan, you know them as the Celtics. But when we're talking about the culture and or cultures and the languages, we talk about Celtic languages. And this used to be, like I said, a very large language, and now it's one of the smallest groups in Indo-European. Okay, and then you can see over here, right? So also Farsi, Kurdish, and languages in farther south in India. Okay, good. So we're going to fast forward a couple thousand years, and we're going to go to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is super important in the history of Western Europe and Central Europe, and then, of course, also basically most of the Mediterranean. And the Romans actually made it all the way up into England, right, which is where, of course, English started. They established what's today Eboracum, which is today York, and Londinium, which is today London. Julius Caesar actually made it all the way up into England, but he was there twice, turned around and left. He didn't have the resources he needed to actually conquer it. But later on, it was in fact conquered by the Romans, and everybody was, in there speaking Celtic languages and speaking Latin, and trying to, Romanize or Latinize most of Britain. But the Roman Empire, right, at least in the West. So we talk about the Roman Empire. It's really more than one empire. It's the western half of the empire and the eastern half of the empire. The western half of the empire is going to fall apart. 430, 450, something like that, Common Era or AD. The Eastern Roman Empire is going to persist for quite a bit longer. It's going to be powerful for a long time, and then it's going to kind of fade out into a little tiny place, and then it's going to disappear. Um, but in any case, there's all sorts of action that's happening. It's called, depending on whether you're a Germanic group, you call it the movement of the people, or if you're an Italic speaking group, you call it the barbarian invasions. And around 400, 450, there's large people movements from Eastern Europe and Central Europe into the Roman Empire that eventually causes the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, that among other things. Um, and you get Germanic tribes going out from Eastern Europe into all over the place. So, for instance, the Visigoths took over Spain and ruled Spain for a couple hundred years. Another group called the Vandals came down and established a pirate kingdom down here in northern Africa. You had all sorts of Germanic tribes ruling in Italy as well, and also right, so again, so around 450, the 430, 450, there's a bunch of civil wars going on. The general who was in charge of Britain took all of the legions from Britain to try to go and become emperor himself. He failed. He lost his head in the battle down here in Gaul, and what that meant was that there was no army left in Britain. And so, if you know your history, you know that if you are near a German country and you have no army, that's kind of a bad idea. And so, over the course of, again, we make it think like there wasn't just a giant invasion of Germans into Britain, but as the Romans leave Britain, there's a bunch of different warlords who are trying to battle each other for power, and initially they start talking to their friends and cousins on the continent, hiring Germanic mercenaries to come over and help them battle each other and establish their own power. And then eventually the mercenaries keep going back and forth and saying, hey, we could probably just go take some of that stuff ourselves. And that's what they start to do. And people from the northwestern coast of Europe start moving in and taking over the Celtic people and pushing the Celtic people farther and farther east and north in Britain, right? This is Britain right here. England. All of this is Britain or the British Isles. England is this chunk here, right? This is Wales. This is Cornwall. This is Ireland. This is Scotland. Okay, good. Just so you can see, right after the fall of the Roman Empire, so there's all sorts of different groups now. Um, and again, right, so the Visigoths run this place. That doesn't mean that all of the children here are Visigothic children. The peasants aren't changing quite as much as the leadership is. Um, okay, so and we can see that the Angles and the Saxons are starting to move in Britain over here too. And you can still see the names of right where the East Saxons were. That's now Essex, right? Where the West Saxons were, that's Wessex. Where the South Saxons were, that's Sussex. Right, Anglia, Mercia, and stuff like that, right? So all the names of the different places in England, many of them still harken all the way back to the invasion. We should just point out, right? You can imagine, right? So the Franks are the people who eventually become the French. The most famous Frank is Charlemagne. Frisians are still there. Um, Saxony, right? This is Lower Saxony now, and Upper Saxony is down over here. It's called Upper Saxony because there's more mountains over there, right? And in Denmark. So you can imagine, for instance, that the Frisians spoke Frisian, the Saxons spoke Saxish, maybe the Utes spoke Utish, and the Angles, of course, spoke Anglish, right? And that's where we get our name for our language that we're speaking today. Okay, so what did Old English sound like, right? It was a Germanic language, and this was, we're talking about 2,000 years ago, well, 1,500 years ago. Father Uri, you'll recognize this, right? So, Our Father art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, as we forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Right. So that's the Lord's Prayer. Real common, and it's been written in lots and lots of different languages, and this is what it would have sounded like in Old English, right? And remember, this is much closer to a Germanic language than English currently is. So, Father Uri, du det art on hefunum, si din name gehargot, få vi kommit in rike, gewurte sin viljan till erfen, swas var on hefunum, Uren gyda chwamnes yn llaf sŵlas tudag, yn trwygu fy sŵr y gwylte swas fa wei vergivet urum gultendum. Yn nega la dos on kostnunge, ar gelysas of ufile, softliche. Right, so right, Father Ure, our Father, du, right, so in German, modern German, du, in Spanish, tu, French, tu, du that art in heaven, right? Be, so even in modern German, sei is the command form for be, right? Be thine, thy, in German, dein, Namen name gehalgot, so hallowed, right? Tobe komme den Rieche in German Reich, right, is a kingdom. So thy Reich, thy kingdom, may it become, right, to exist. Gewürde is to dignify your will on earthen, swa on heaven, right, on earth as in heaven. Or gedachwanlichen Schlaf zulässt du dag. So today, give us today our gedankenqualmlichen Schlaf, our daily loaf, right? Give us a day our daily bread. So you can see Tag right there means day, German Tag. And there you can see Tag right in there as well. And forgive us our guilts as we forgive our guilt and doom, right? So people who sin against us or who antagonize, I guess, and not lead thou us on temptation, but leave us of evil, right? So cliche, right? We supplicate or we pray, we get on our knees. Okay. Right. So quite a bit different from English. You can still see lots of words and lots of things that are related there. If you also speak German, this makes more sense, or Dutch or something like that. But it's quite a bit different from modern English, right? And some of the things that we saw in there, right, is you get direct negation of verbs. So, right, we can say "not drinkest thou wine," which doesn't make any sense, right? You can't say drink you," right? Don't you drink or aren't you drinking or something like that. Um, Right? Haven't we a king? Not have we a king? Have is a weird word, right? Sometimes it's possession, sometimes it's auxiliary, sometimes you can directly do it. We also get the verb instead of in the second spot, like it normally is in English. We get it all the way at the end of the sentence. We, you know, right? Kann from German kennen, kith and ken, right? He nelarde, to advise. She, him advised. And then a big separation between auxiliary verbs and main verbs, right? So have her food brought, right? He has her food brought, and so he brought their food, right? Or heges out on a man, right? Um, that's not really belonging there. You also got lots of different sorts of suffixes that go in there, depending on whether it's the nominative is the subject, the object, the possessive, or the indirect object. You have two different kinds of declension, so all sorts of weird stuff going on with nouns and suffixes and stuff. All of that's disappeared from modern English, right? If you were to look at modern Icelandic, you would see a table that's very similar to this as well. You also had verbal inflection, right? So, like for instance, in Spanish or German, yo trabajo, tú trabajas, él trabaja, nosotros trabajamos, ellos trabajan. English also had that kind of suffix system too, right? And German has a similar. So, in German, ich kann, du kannst, er kann, wir können. Right, and you can see that you get the suffixes change depending on who the subject is, both in the present tense and in the past tense. Right, in the past tense, of course, in English is totally invariant today. Okay, good. So now we're going to move on from Old English to Middle English. Middle English, it's kind of, these dates are kind of arbitrary, right? So the language has been changing across this whole period of time, but we're gonna pin important sort of arbitrary switch points, quasi arbitrary, not totally, on big events in the language. And a really big event happens in 1066 in England, and that's the invasion of England from Normandy. Right. This is a part of the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a really, really long tapestry that explains this whole thing that happened. Um, the history of the Normans is really quite interesting too, right? So originally they're a Viking group that comes down into France. They besiege Paris. They take a couple of cities. The king of France goes over and says, "Hey, he tries to kick them out of the city, and he can't get them, so he pays them money, right? Danegeld." Um, uh, Says, "Hey, please leave the city." The Vikings say, "Okay," they'll take the money. They leave the city. They go conquer another city. The king of France goes back, tries to kick him out, can't do it. Says, "Okay, look, take my money, or here, tell you what. Instead of that, why don't you just go? We've got this whole big area up in the north that's got not a whole lot of people there. We'd love to have you go. You can live there all you want. All you have to do two things, right? You got to protect us from anything in the north, like other Vikings, and you got to convert to Christianity." And so the Danes say, "Okay, that's a deal. We'll do that." And there's lots of stories. It's kind of funny about how they eventually convert, and but really quickly they sort of become Romanized, right? So they stop speaking or Norwegian or whatever dialect that they were speaking, and start speaking French. They take on Christianity. They start building castles. They start fighting wars in the Central European way and become really powerful. They expand. They're fighting in the Mediterranean. They're fighting all over Europe. In any case, in 1066, the old king dies. William the Confessor, Edward the Confessor dies, and there's a succession crisis. Who's going to be the next king? Because he doesn't have any heirs. The really powerful guy named Harold Godwinson says, "I'm going to be the king." Um, there's another Norwegian king. Harald Hardrada, he says, no, I'm going to be the king because I made a deal with the old king's father. And then there's this guy William, the Duke of Normandy, who says, no, the Edward the Confessor said I was going to be king when he died, and so the guy who's actually there, Harold Godwinson, has to go up first. He goes up all the way up into northern part of England and fights off and destroys Harold Hardrada, who also quite interesting if you're interested in sort of Viking history. Anyway, kills him, and says, "Oh, okay, it's the fall. There's no way that William's going to invade. Now everybody can go home, get your crops, take your crops in." William finally gets fair wind, can sail from France, and actually goes into England. They have a big battle called the Battle of Hastings, where William Godwinson, the king, or the erstwhile king of England, gets an arrow in his eye. This is the story. We don't really know if that's exactly what happened. That's what seems to be told in the Bayeux Tapestry. He dies. William now becomes not just Duke of Normandy. Now he's William the Conqueror, King of England. He goes through the rest of England and you know forces all of the other dukes to give up. And then starts a reign of French nobility, essentially, or Norman nobility taking over for all of England for the next 500-600 years. Um, and what you end up with is you have a bilingual situation where most of the peasants are speaking Anglo-Saxon, and most of the nobility and the clergy are speaking um, uh, Norman French. And so tons and tons and tons and tons of French words come into English. This widespread bilingualism flattens out the grammar. You get all of the suffixes disappear. The former freewheeling sort of word order disappears, and we have this really English, really rigid word order all of a sudden. Here's just a few of the words that pop up that used to, or that are French roots. That pop up into English. Depending on who you talk to, people will say something like 40% of the English vocabulary is Germanic, 40% of the English vocabulary is French slash Latin, and the other, 20% is who knows where. English takes lots of is free, happily borrows things. Um, it could be even more, right? It could be more like 50% of the words are French origin. Most of the ones, and you can actually tell, and you actually know, even though you don't know that you know, that which words are Latin words and which words are Germanic words because of the kinds of suffixes they take, right? So cred, right, to means to believe, think, basically the same thing. And you could say something's incredible, but you can't really. I mean, uncredible doesn't really work, right? Likewise, unthinkable is hard to imagine, and that's because and there's whole sets of words like this that you could go and look up if you wanted to pull out a dictionary and find Latin prefixes and Germanic prefixes, and the way that they take other prefixes, or sorry, take which roots they take depends on whether they originated in French or whether they originated in Anglo-Saxon. Okay. You can also see two different kinds of word formation in English, right? So typically, languages tend to be of the compounding or of a root system, and English has both. So you get and German, right? Is people make fun of poor German for having all these wonderfully long words. So this is an actual word in German. It's a legal word, right? So it's not an everyday kind of word. Rindfleischetikettierungsüberwachungsaufgabenübertragungsgesetz, and this was the change of back in the day when there was a big problem with mad cow disease. They had to change how beef was uh, uh, regulated, and so this is the law that did that. But English really does that too, and you get lots of these in German. You can do this all the time, but the reason the words are so long is just a spelling convention, right? English kind of does that too, right? So the dining room table, is that one word, three words? It's one concept. It behaves like a word, right? Or a third base umpire or upstairs bedroom. Those are all compounds. In English, we tend to leave a space between them, but we could run them all together if we wanted to, right? It's just a little bit harder. And we can make new compounds all the time. It's really easy to do, and sometimes they're easy to see what they mean, and sometimes they're not so much. Now, the other way of making words in English is the Latin way to do it, right? And this we have these roots, that sometimes the meaning is transparent and sometimes the meaning is less transparent. Right, so cline probably means, on an angle somewhere. So, but you get an incline, recline, or a decline. A deuce, now it doesn't mean two, right? But you induce, reduce, deduce, inspire, expire, respire, perspire, conspire. Spire in this case probably has something to do with movement, right? So expire, or right, to breathe out, to inspire, to breathe in, to respire is just breath, perspire like water coming out. But conspire, I don't know where that comes from. In any case, right? Preclude, exclude, include, right? And so English, because of this smash up with French, has lost a bunch of the suffixes that might have let it be a more free word order language. And you also get two systems of word formation that we've seen before. So, what did Middle English sound like? So, you might have had the chance to read the Canterbury Tales when you were in high school. I don't know. Here on the left is the Middle English version. Here on the right is a modern English translation. I'm going to read it for you. Remember, this is a poem, right? So it's got a rhythm or a meter to it. So this doesn't mean it's going to sound, it's a little bit artificial, right? Because people didn't walk around talking in iambic pentameter, and people don't today. But it's going to sound a little bit like that. But we'll get an idea of what it could have sounded like anyway, right? So, Juan April with the shoe the rocht of March that bears to the rote, and bathed every vein in which liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the floor. When Zephyrs ache with the sweet breath, inspired heart in every holt and heath, the tender croppis, and the young son hath in the ramas half coursey runne, and smale faules maken melodieën that slippen aan de nicht with open ye. So pricketh him naturen hier courages, dan a longen volt te gaan on pilgrimages, and palmeris for the sake and stroges strondis, de ferne halwis, quoten sondre londis, especially from every sheer ende, van gelante kan de buri de wende, the holy bliss for marto for the sake, that him hath holpen van that they were sake. Right, and you can read it along if you want. If you take a little bit of time, you can see lots and lots of stuff that this does actually sound a lot more like English, right? Modern English than the old English. So it's well on its way. And we're not going to bother you anymore because now, right by the time we get to Shakespeare, we're talking about modern English, and that's just sort of natural progression. So here, William the Conqueror over here, and Billy Shakes, as I like to call him, William Shakespeare. So that's a brief history of the English language. Hopefully that was interesting to you. If you have any questions, you know how to get in touch with me, Hughes at csusm.edu, or message me on Canvas. Adios, ciao, tschüss, goodbye.